Good afternoon and welcome to today's session, Community Disruption and Reinvention, Strategies Targeting the Roots of Division. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon with my co-facilitator, Candace Sargent. Both she and I are from the Divided Community Project housed at The Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law. We're hosting this conversation with Carl Smallwood from Columbus, Ohio, Sirlane Grant from San Leandro, California, Maquiba Reese from Bloomington, Indiana, and Sarah Banna from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And before we begin, we want to acknowledge where we are on today, March 19th, 2021. 3 days ago, a white male killed 8 individuals, including 6 Asian Americans, outside 3 Atlanta area spas. On March 13th, it was the 1-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor's death. Meanwhile, the trial of the man who killed George Floyd is ongoing in Minnesota. Advocates for Black lives continue to demonstrate and work on behalf of their communities across the country. And the COVID-19 pandemic continues. These events have happened in communities, but are impacting all of us on a national scale, regardless of where we live, work, and play. In light of the lives lost due to racial violence this week, and the many lives lost to racial violence in the past months, years, and decades, we want to collectively pause and take a moment of silence to honor and respect those lives. So here we are. Many communities are tense. Many communities are divided, but there's hope on the horizon. Vaccines are coming. Communities are coming together, pushed by advocates. This afternoon, we hope to leverage today's participants to share lessons learned targeting the roots of division, to support community reinvention after tense disruption. We hope to give all of you in the audience ideas about how you can apply dispute resolution principles in your community. So I'll turn to Candace, my colleague, for introductions and to start with our first question.
Great, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I just wanted to give a little bit of a fuller description of our panelists today. So Sarah Banna is joining us from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and she's going to talk a little bit about her work as an advocate there. She's going to discuss her work with fellow advocates, police, and nonprofit organizations in the Oklahoma City's metropolitan area, Police and Community Trust, PACT initiative. PACT has been in operation for just over 5 years and has faced significant stress over the summer of 2020 and is now working to rebuild trust again across its stakeholder groups. Next, we have Sirlane Grant from the San Leandro area, and she's going to talk a little bit more about her work on unity in the community in San Leandro. It was a group formed in response to a series of hate incidents in 2016. Sirlane will also focus on how unity in the community evolved after a local police officer shot and killed Stephen Taylor inside of a local Walmart in April of 2020. Next, coming from Bloomington, Indiana, we have Maquiba Reese. And she's going to talk a little bit about how the community has responded following demonstrations at a city-owned farmers market where there was an outing of a farmer as a white supremacist. And Ms. Reese will talk a little bit about the city's ongoing resident-led efforts to advance racial equity. And finally, Carl Smallwood out of the Greater Columbus Community Trust will talk about the trust's efforts to address racial inequality in the Columbus region. That is it for the introductions. So on to the first question. And this one is directed at Ms. Reese and Ms. Grant. I'll start with Ms. Grant. So how do communities respond collaboratively when hate and white supremacists come to town. Ms. Grant, you work with unity in the community, so I'm sure you have some experiences you can pull from with this. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. So I'm going to provide a little context to San Leandro. We're here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we share our border, our city limit with Oakland and Hayward. So we are the city just next door to that great cultural mecca of Oakland, California. And race-based crime or hate, unfortunately, is not new to San Leandro. And I'll speak a little bit about the history of San Leandro. But in 2016, it showed up, I'll just say it this way, it showed up at our front door. And it has stayed there. And as a community, we came together and said, no, this is not what we want. But it's been documented, the history of San Leandro has been documented by many historians and sociologists that Robert Self is one who wrote about the city in American Babylon, that for years, civic leaders and real estate folks and finance people, the men's groups in town were able to keep restrictive and redlining kinds of policies in place, even after it was long illegal and on, federal laws forbid it. We in this town experienced where we could buy. My first offer at a home in San Leandro was rejected, even though it was at an offer that was higher than what it ultimately sold for. And the realtor said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You probably don't want to live there anyway." Okay, I'm glad I live in the place I live. I have great neighbors. But at the time, I didn't know the history of San Leandro when that happened. San Leandro was known as a sundown city. So as soon as folks came in, they came in to work in San Leandro. As soon as it got dark, they had to go back to Oakland or wherever, people of color. And that extended until the 90s. I got stopped across the street from my own house. I went through the whole drill. And I said to the officer, if there's a problem, I can walk home. And he's like, "Do you live in the neighborhood?" "I live right there." And he's like, "Okay, you can go home." So that was in 1997. So this is San Leandro. It used to be called Clan Leandro. I'm not saying this with pride. I'm saying this so that people can understand the history of the city. So that was the kind of backdoor. I'll call that the backdoor hate. That's the subtle racism that we knew that was here. But something happened between, say, 1997, when I got stopped, and where we are right now, and that there was a big shift, a big demographic shift in San Leandro. And there was a change of people of color in administration. We've had city managers of color. We've had finance directors of color. We've had school superintendents of color. So there's been remarkable change. And what was a city that in 1970 was 97% white, and right now, as I sit before you, there is no one group of people who has a majority. We are a very diverse city. We're diverse in culture. We're diverse in income. There's no one place you can go. Yes, we have those census tracts and those the housing requirements for Section 8 voucher housing and so forth. But there's no one place you can come in San Leandro and say that's where all of these kinds of people live. Every income, every racial group is mixed up. So, and now we have a population of about 90,000 people. And like I said, there's no one group that stands out. The African-American population is about 10%. The Asian population is about 35%. And everyone else kind of fits in between somewhere. White population, 45, maybe 45%. So when March 2016 came around, we just assumed we were a better city. We were more tolerant, more diverse, more everything. And we literally woke up one morning to hateful graffiti that left out no one and no group of people, sprawled all over the school administration building, which also shares a site with one of the schools. And then we woke up one morning in the same spring to hateful graffiti sprayed on a kind of a wall monument area of our Marina Park, which is a huge park on the San Francisco Bay waterfront that people come to from all over because it's a great park. It has a great walking course and bike trails and so forth and so on. And then we found the N-word sprawled on a barbershop window that had been in business for 30 years. And our Black church, our traditional Black Baptist church in town, which we hadn't had, they were fairly new. They had some property defaced as well. So this was the new San Leandro in 2016. And so when the first incident happened, one of our community elders, an African-American gentleman who had been part of the 60s civil rights era, called me up and said, and I was no longer in office, called me up and said, I'm going to have an emergency meeting. We're going to get everybody together. And it was 10 o'clock when he called. He says, I'm going to do this at 2 o'clock. And I said, oh, no one's going to come. No one's going to come. It's only 4 hours. Nobody's going to come. Everyone came, between the people he called and the people I called. And so it was the police chief who was white, the police captain who was Latinx, a couple of city council people who had been worked with me, school leaders, the director of our social services division. They all came and we showed up and we formed unity in the community. And we started our mission to be against racism by having teach-ins and rallies and so forth and so on. And so in the spirit of the workshop here, the strategies, I would say that collaboratively, we worked collaboratively. There wasn't any leader. We were all working to solve a problem. And like I said, the chief even showed up. We were working with the police chief. And we had these relationships that we had already forged that we could call people together. And we entered the room with respect and not with a sense of entitlement. And there's no leader, but there's a facilitator, which is myself. And I'll just close and say that out of that, when we had police shootings, we had a police shooting in, as you alluded to, in April, just a year ago, April 2020, we've all come together still to fight police violence and work through. Now there's about 10 different social justice organizations because of the changing population who are working with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sir Lane. It's incredible that you and the longstanding leader were able to convene a group so quickly and bring seemingly the right stakeholders into the conversation and are still working to do collaborative, collective work in the community. Such a huge credit to your advocacy. I want to turn to Mukwege now. And before I do, Mukwege, I want to read this quote from Bloomington Mayor John Hamilton from July 2019. So another reality we have in Bloomington is the presence of the doctrine of white supremacy, its pervasive role in our collective history, and its presence still today. Mm-hmm. I realize that this does not jive with the Bloomington many of us think of, that we are proud of, that we cherish. We know we must continually acknowledge today's more progressive Bloomington has grown through our 200-year history in a soil laced with the toxin of racism. Like our state and our country, our community was long home to both overt and covert white supremacy built into our laws, culture, and mores. Mukwege, I know that you faced a white supremacist incident in Bloomington where individuals aligned with the movement for Black Lives demonstrated to out a farmer at a farmer's market aligned with white supremacists. That was in the summer of 2019.
Yeah.
Tell us how your communities moved.
Yeah. So first I want to acknowledge the fact that there's a team of us that have decided to come together like it's time for us to take control of what's going on in our community. And another thing I want to acknowledge is that I want us to make sure that we're not giving this false idea that white supremacists aren't still there. There are individuals that are still very much maybe associated, but just kind of maybe infused in a different way of the infrastructure. And so therefore, I don't think that only acknowledging this one incident will cover everything that's taking place in the fabric of Bloomington. But this specific incident took place in 2019, and I want to give a shout out to our local advocate, Abby Ang, who actually was one of the four came up front and acknowledged the fact that we had known white supremacists in our farmers market. And then also some local farmers too were also advocating for the fact that there have been some known supremacists, or I would actually say nationalists, white nationalists in our farmers market. And so the frustration there, right, is because you have tax dollars associated with your city and they're essentially funding, right? And so that was some things that took place within Bloomington. We definitely had a lot of hard times of collaborating because of course there's a mistrust, right? If you know within your city where you pump dollars and stuff like that, and your city is housing a non-white nationalist, there's some distrust, rightfully so, right? And so at the moment, so that was revealed in 2016. 2019 is when the advocacy started to take place. But you can also kind of go historically and see the intricacies within the history within Bloomington. And so something that I think we are doing a better job at in Bloomington is listening, but the listening is coming because of the pressure of the advocates. And so that's something that's going to continue to happen. And for those that are listening, I know that there might seem like it's a lot of frustration with advocates voicing their opinions and their frustrations, but that's part of disruption so that we can move forward and acknowledge how to do our best to move forward to essentially move into a space of where we say wanted to develop an ecosystem of care and responsibility.
Wow. Yes. Thank you so much for your perspective on that. The part that really jumped out to me was the listening from the city is coming because of the pressure of the advocates and coming off of the momentum of the Summer of Advocacy of 2020. I think other people hearing that and other communities hearing that this is working in places and people are starting to listen just goes a long way.
I do agree with that. There have been many local activists, even young activists. I give a shout out to Enough is Enough, who was able to get about 5,000 to 7,000 people in Bloomington to express that enough is enough, and we want change in our community. And those young advocates also made sure to express their voices the summer of 2020.
Well, thank you, Maquiba. Really dynamic work that you're engaged in Bloomington. And we'll make sure those resources are posted on the conference website so that folks have access to them. We want to turn now briefly to Carl Smallwood from the Greater Columbus Community Trust and Sarah Banna, who's going to talk about some advocacy work taking place in Oklahoma. Specifically, we want to ask how your communities, whether it's Oklahoma City or Tulsa or Columbus, how your communities are responding to racism, to institutionalized racism, to implicit bias, to structures that are set up to the disadvantage of Black and brown communities across the country. What are you doing in Columbus, Tulsa, and Oklahoma City? And first, we'll turn to Carl Smallwood.
Well, thank you, Bill. In many ways, the responses in Columbus have mirrored what's happened in other communities. So you've seen protests, you've seen organized groups working to have their voices heard. But one of the things I guess I'd like to talk about today is something called Greater Columbus Community Trust. And just to set the stage for you, Columbus, Ohio is the 14th largest city in the country, The metropolitan area is larger than the city and is not quite as high up in ranking. But we're a pretty diverse community, 58% or so white, but a large immigrant community. We have the second largest Somali community in the country behind Minneapolis. And 8 or 9% of the people in Columbus are foreign born. So, and Columbus Community Trust came into existence in early 2016. And again, you've got to sort of think back to that time. It may be a little hard given the last 4 years, but that's at a point in time where anti-immigrant sentiment was beginning, or at least becoming more visible and vocal. Then candidate Trump gave voice to it as well. And so, and of course, in our community, as in other communities, there were police shootings and other incidents that brought the Black community in particular in confrontation with law enforcement and other forces. So that's the context in which Columbus Community Trust was born. And it was an effort by the bar associations in Columbus, the Columbus Bar Association and the John Mercer Langston Bar Association, which is the national bar affiliate, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Columbus. And the U.S. Attorney at the time was an African-American U.S. Attorney, and others, to convene a group of stakeholders in Columbus to address the divisions within the community along racial lines, immigration lines, religious lines, all of the different issues that would divide communities like ours. And so after we got that small group together of essentially lawyers, we reached out to others in the community, other stakeholders, faith leaders, nonprofit leaders, United Way, Urban League, YWCA, city officials. So the city attorney's office participated. We had a couple of judges who participated, community members who participated, law enforcement representatives who participated, and they came together and began to think about the issues that would bind these communities more strongly. And the first concept that came to our minds when we met was we need to trust each other. And that seemed to be a universal hope for all of us. So we began meeting, and if I could share a screen for just a second, Bill, I may be able to sort of show something that will be helpful and perhaps save a little bit of time. Here is the mission of Columbus Community Trust. It was to bring people together to understand each other more deeply, to build trust between residents and the community leaders, to identify processes that would help us deal justly with the concerns that the community has, and prepare us to respond in a resourceful way if events occurred. And events, of course, continued to occur in the course of Community Trust. The structure, at least, of this was that we would have this larger umbrella group, and then we would have groups that would work on issues like readiness. What will we do on day one if some event occurs? Future concerns. Is somebody thinking ahead about the issues that will confront the community? How do we make the community more resilient? How do we involve youth in this? So there were a number of processes. I'll stop sharing now and wrap up. But essentially, we began to work on those issues so that we would be able to prepare ourselves. And of course, the summer of 2020 happened. And I don't know that we were quite as prepared as we wanted to be, because the summer of 2020 hit Columbus like it hit a lot of other communities. But we had established some relationships before the summer of 2020, and those continue to this day. And I think that it has put us in a position to speak more directly to the community about some of the events that have occurred in Columbus. There were 2 shootings of Black men in Columbus in December of 2020 that were a significant shock to our system, and Community Trust spoke to those. The riots at the Capitol on January 6th were a shock to the system, and we expected armed militia at our State House. And we spoke to the community about that. And we've been involved in some educational activities as well. So I'll stop there so I don't go too long, but obviously in the conversation that'll follow, maybe we'll talk a little bit more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. I think the part that really stood out to me there was that it's by no accident that the group is named the Greater Columbus Community Trust, and how in 2020, when everything went down over the summer, that trust was put to the test, and it seemed as if Columbus was somewhat prepared because they had built up that trust over a period of 5 years and built those relationships in the Columbus community. So it's great to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Candace and Carl. And now we're going to turn to Sarah Bana, who's been an advocate in the Oklahoma City community, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Norman communities across the state of Oklahoma for a number of years. She's we're going to share a screen. She's had, and I'll let her describe the video that's been developed to highlight and support this part of the conversation. I'm going to go on mute. Sarah, if you could.
Thank you, Bill. So first and foremost, I want to thank Ty Baker of the Oklahoma Black Times for first and foremost being in the trenches of civil uprisings and civil mobility for equity and justice over the past year. And he has captured some incredible footages of many local grassroots organic movements that have occupied spaces, echoing voices of marginalized people across our communities. I want to thank all the young activists and advocates whose images you are seeing, whose courage and whose intelligence and conscience drove them to the public streets to demand accountability and justice. I want to go back to what Sterling was saying. Oklahoma, I live in the heartland of America, and the heartland of America is bloodied by genocide, slavery, and heinous acts of immorality and inhumanity. This is the Indian Territory, as we called it, which was then bombarded by the Boomer movement and the settlement of white folks moving into the Indian Territory. Oklahoma is the home of one of the most violent race riots in American history, the Tulsa Race Massacre, and the burning of Black Wall streets to the ashes by white militant deputized men. Oklahoma is the home of Ada Sapil Fisher, who applied to get admission to the law school at the University of Oklahoma, who was denied. Oklahoma is the home of Clara Luper, a prominent civil rights leader who organized and mobilized the youth to participate in sit-ins at the Katz drugstore to fight for equal accommodations. We are also the home of bloodthirsty men, such as former prosecutor Bob Macy, also known as Cowboy Bob, who's sent more people to death row than any other individual prosecutor in the nation. We are also home to the Oklahoma City bombing, where 168 people, including 19 children, were killed by anti-government militant extremists radicalized by Ruby Ridge and Waco. In 2014, in recognition of the history of this land that we continue to struggle with, as well as the current existing conditions that have left Oklahoma comparable to developing countries. Our quality of life is so poor that statistically you can literally compare it to nations that are not even considered to be democracies. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. We are fourth in the nation as a state for the number of individuals killed by law enforcement. Oklahoma City Police Department, our largest police department, is ranked second in the nation for its lethality and its brutality. Our SPLC has tracked at least 12 active hate crimes. The Klan, one of the largest Klan headquarters, is approximately 30 minutes away from me here in Shawnee, Oklahoma. So the history compounded by the existing conditions, compounded by the police brutality and violence that is forever more caught on tape, where we have law enforcement with badges and gun committing heinous crimes caught on tape without any official accountability or any fulfillment of public justice, kind of deteriorating our community and the trust we have in the integrity of our institutions, compounded by the racist rhetoric of exploitative politicians, particularly under the Trump presidency, where communities were being targeted, that really exasperated many Oklahomans who'd been suffering and struggling for years and decades. As a result, post George Floyd, many Oklahomans were touched by the suffering, the human pain, the inequity and the injustice that we observed on that footage that was caught on tape. Oklahomans were very angry and enraged, rightfully so, and poured into the public streets demanding police accountability and justice. And unfortunately, we were actually confronted with more police brutality and violence as we were trying to demonstrate and protest. Now, the positive thing that I want to go to is that in 2014, as a result of everything that was going in Ferguson, we actually tried to be proactive. We created a coalition and an initiative called the Police and Community Trust, where we brought opposing professionals and community members who had opposing views on public safety, but also were stakeholders in public safety together to try to remedy both the history of policing in Oklahoma, as well as some of the current conditions that needed to evolve and change to create a higher quality of public safety for all of us. Unfortunately, in 2020, compounded with everything that was going on in this nation, our efforts and PACT were not enough to prevent civil unrest, to prevent days and weeks and months and continuing going into a year of protesting. Our hope is now is to take a step back and see what we have learned over this past year and remobilize and rejuvenate our previous stakeholders, recruit additional stakeholders to really analyze Oklahoma as a case study of what went wrong, what could have been done proactively to prevent what happened here locally, and to hopefully address some of the historical and systemic inequities that exist that are really the contributing underlying factors of the divisions that we are seeing here locally. For my part, in 2020, I left the boardrooms. I left some of the discussion tables that I was currently sitting at because the urgency was in the public streets and with the young people who were demanding justice and putting their lives and liberty at risk. And I think we've achieved a lot. Those young people that you saw were able to redirect $35 million of COVID relief money back to the families who needed it through protests and through this disturbances that were required. We were able to collectively as a community hold 6 officers this year alone accountable for some of these police involved shootings, which is very new for the precedent we've had in Oklahoma. We will continue to fight utilizing every avenue available within our democracy until we all have more of an equitable and just life.
Sarah, you are doing such dynamic work with your colleagues in Oklahoma. It's really just inspiring. The rest of the conversation now is going to transition to everyone, but I want to turn back to you, Sarah, with the first question, because I think perhaps it applies most directly to the groups that you're working with, the advocates in the community who are frustrated that despite prior advocacy, despite so much work, that so little has been done. You cited off all those statistics in Oklahoma about being a developing country, about incarceration rates. How does an organization like PACT, like the police community advocacy group that you referenced, that was formed in 2014 after Ferguson, how does an organization like PACT get buy-in from individuals who are frustrated because they are constantly let down by those in charge? So Sarah, I'd love to hear your response and then open it to the group for discussion.
I think we definitely have to do a better job of empowering and including individuals who are directly impacted, particularly the younger generation who's been sidelined from the decision-making tables. These young people have so much passion, they're very intelligent and skilled, and I think giving them some control and ownership of the outcomes and some mechanisms of holding power brokers and decision makers accountable is a great way to move forward. And I also want to say, you know, there were a lot of things that went down in certain municipalities because of failure of packed stakeholders to do what they were being advised. Whereas we had other municipalities where the police chief and the community leaders were willing to negotiate and de-escalate, and then we did not see the civil divisions and the uprisings and the police brutality and the weaponry. It wasn't necessary because we were able to negotiate, resolve, and get along and de-escalate the situation. So there is hope in that collaborative work. But I think as we move forward, we really must empower the voices of directly impacted people who've been strategically kept out of these dialogues.
And I want to kind of follow off of what Sarah was saying. I think that it's going to be really important that we don't make things palatable or coddle people, because we have to be specific. So if we're talking about certain groups of individuals that are supposed to be at these tables, we need to say we need Black people that are angry. If they're angry, they're justly angry. And I think that people get really upset or nervous to work with people that are angry, but those are the people that have been sidelined and they're voicing their concerns, and it's time for us to listen to them. And I think that we look for this monolithic Black person, or we look for this individual that will articulate in a way, and it's just like, that's not really fair. I think that we look for the Martin Luther Kings or the Rosa Parks, which actually they were very radical, but some people think that they were like, I don't know. But I think it's going to be really important for us for individuals to get buy-in is to listen to all groups of people and not only select the group that you are most comfortable with. And so that means being uncomfortable with being comfortable with being uncomfortable, excuse me. So I think that that's going to be really important.
I just want to say, I hear this question as a question of power dynamics, when people in charge let you down. And I think that what happens with community coalition building is that you can bring a collective voice into the room to challenge the power structure. And so that's one way of doing it. The other way, in unity of the community, we have some of those voices that come to the table, so to speak. And there are other people who wish those voices weren't at the table. But I contend that we need everybody at the table, as Carl said, to build that trust, to start that work proactively so that people won't feel let down, so that the council members who are in charge, the policymakers who are in charge, can hear the voices and respond. And then if that doesn't happen, we take to the streets, because that has happened. That has happened with unity in the community. It's like, we're not getting what we want. We're going to show up. And we're going to show up with the young people who are now showing up, because that's a new dynamic since 2020. Like I said, for the longest, unity in the community was the only social justice group in town. Now we have like another 10, and many of them are driven by young people, and I am so happy.
And Charlene knows what she's talking about. And as city council person, a former city council person, I think now former is the correct part. Right. But having sat in those rooms where the power resides, can appreciate it in some respects from both sides. And McQueen is absolutely right. I mean, people get angry. It's helpful, though. It's healthy to live in that discomfort for a bit and to put in a room the sheriff of a county and a social justice advocate who's angry about the lack of response, community-wide, and let them have a conversation. I mean, work on something together for a minute so that the next time they come together, they're not quite as foreign to each other. You've got to build that trust then.
Yeah, and to all of you out there, as you're listening, think in the context of this conversation about what tools you can use in your dispute resolution, mediation, and attorney toolkit to support your communities. We'll get you some ideas as in the next 25 minutes as we keep talking here, but think about what tools you can use in your communities. Candace?
Thanks, Bill, for teeing up my next question. So for Carl and everybody else on this discussion, I'm directing this more at Carl at first, but happy to hear from everybody else. So I'm asking you to put on your facilitator hat right now. And what are some questions when you go into these communities as a facilitator? What are some of these questions that need to be asked in order to address the divisions?
I mean, one, I think you need to figure out who should take the initiative to promote a process for planning during tranquil times, hopefully. That's ultimately, that's what we want. You know, we run some simulations occasionally to give people a sense of what can happen during crisis. And the thing they then ask themselves is, boy, I wish we'd had more time to plan. Well, okay. Now, who's going to take charge of that? And lawyers and dispute resolution professionals are wonderfully suited to do that work because they're process driven. They can then let the community leaders sort of decide what the ultimate outcome is going to be. But to design the process, that's our work. You know, how do you convince the key officials and leaders to participate is another important question. And again, we probably have the networks to make that happen, to bring those people to the table. So it's important to develop, do you have any sort of early warning system as part of the plan? Because if there isn't, one needs to be created. We've got to be able to do some planning. I mean, there are a number of questions that I think are important to raise in order to get the community to the place where they will be ready on the day that an event occurs that challenges trust. And the question then is, do you have the plan in place? And if not, what can you create that will give your civic leaders, your governmental leaders, your activists a way in the first couple hours of that crisis to communicate with each other for the benefit of the community?
I could weigh in on that. I could say there's two things. A very tactile thing is to know who should be at the table, who should be in the room, who should be there. I mean, like, have a piece of paper and write them down. Is it Sterling Grant? Is it Bernard Ashcraft, the civil rights leader? Is it the pastor of the largest church in town? Or is it the pastor of the, churches are the most segregated hour at 11 o'clock, but they're a community. So you can go to the Black Baptist church, the Asian church, actually we have an Asian Baptist church, so I meant to say church. The Jewish synagogue, where do you need to go? Have that list of people. And then I think you also need proactively to set your goal. What is your goal? What are you trying? Unity in the community. Our first goal is to eliminate racism in our city. A second goal now, because of the police shooting, is to establish a sense of safety. Like, those of us, even with power and privilege and white and Black and others, we don't necessarily feel safe right now. So that's, how are we going to get there?
And I'd like to respond to that as well. And I'm coming in with my social work hat on. So we, in Bloomington, we're doing a resident-led task force. And that's something that has been trickled down for many cities to participate in and to facilitate. And so something that I would encourage, like, I hear the process, but we actually have to develop those relationships. I think that that's going to be the most important thing. I don't want to go in a room only when there's a problem, right? So it's like, how do you develop those constant relationships with people before the problem starts? And so that's going to be really important for us to build that trust, so that if I am over a mega church or something like that, I know that you're wanting buy-in because you have a relationship with me and you want to collaborate, versus telling me to come somewhere before an incident occurs. And so I think it's going to be really important to do some research to check the temperature of our communities. right? How are people feeling in the climate of America at this moment? What does support look like for you? Those are some simple questions that we can ask individuals versus having a tough process only. I think collaboratively, I think that's going to be really important to see where people are. And then also ask the question, what are your immediate needs? I think of Maslow hierarchy of need, even though that was stolen from Blackfoot Nation, but I digress. You want to look at what are the basic needs of people? Are they being met? And then we can move up to the additional things that they'll need. So I think that in order to have buy-in, you have to have a relationship and build that off of going to their events, being a part of their community, going where they are, just like what Charlene just mentioned, and so did Carl. So I think that it's going to be really important to build that relationship.
Oh man, Mukweba, I love everything you just said. The social worker in you is really coming out here. Maslow's hierarchy stolen from, this is news, I'm learning this from Blackfoot Nation. Is that what I heard?
Well, I don't know if he stole it or not because I wasn't there, but he got a lot of his like his ideas from the Blackfoot Nation. Yes.
Well, thank you for raising that. I want to look more into that.
Absolutely.
I, particularly now during COVID, and with so many other crises going on, we need to focus on those basic human needs first. I think that is so right. But your point about trust is spot on. And we need to bring people in the room, not to bring them into the room, not for a transactional agreement that you tell me this information and maybe I'll do something for you, but to build authentic, dynamic relationships. So those relationships can be leveraged and used for the benefit of everyone during a crisis. And maybe those relationships take a lot of time to build. But in my brief experience compared to those of you on this call, it's been fun building many of them. I've really enjoyed learning about dynamic, diverse people. It's been a lot of fun. So I want to turn to a question about diversity. And I also, before I want to or go to more questions, I want to thank the folks who gave me many of these questions. I put out a call on the dispute resolution listserv. I got some responses from colleagues at Moritz and students at the College of Law at Ohio State, as well as Eisenberg's class at the University of Maryland, Carey College of Law. So thanks to all of you for giving us questions. Here it is, and this is for Sarah. Media and others pigeonhole race into binary black and white constructs. Native, Latinx, Hispanic, and refugees communities face discrimination. And now anti-Asian violence is on the rise in communities across the country, as we've seen on the West Coast. Charlene's seen it in San Leandro. We've seen it in Atlanta this week. How do we empower all communities to feel welcome, safe, and valued? Sarah?
So thank you for pitching this one my way. I'm a first generation Iranian American. I'm an immigrant to this country. And I think one of the things that I have had to process and evolve and better understand is oppression and racism, and the fact that they are universal ideas being applied across the globe, right? Here in America, we think racism and oppression are inherently American problems, but the reality is, coming from Iran, in that culture, right, I was being ingrained, whether it was through the education or culture or some of the theological dogmas, to have oppressive tendencies or sometimes racist behaviors, right? I mean, I came from a country where there are a lot of bad things said about a lot of other nations and a lot of other cultures and heritages, right? And then I migrated to the United States, where racism and oppression were being perpetuated against different groups of people, right? So I think a big piece of this is educating all human beings about patterns and practices of oppression, identifying what oppression looks like in practice, right? Identifying what racism and its sources are in practice, in words, in deeds, in policies, so that all people are better equipped to first identify the problem, recognize where the source or it is, and being able to have better skills in first responding to it, addressing it, or even at times, even if we can't change communities or other people around us, at least being able to cope and heal and at least, you know, survive through it, you know, because some communities are bad enough where it does come down to your survival. Can you survive in a absolutely violent and racist community, right? So I think education is a big, huge part of it, is also helping people understand that marginalized communities from different segments are all hurting and suffering. And I think that was one of the most inspiring things that really unified many Oklahomans was, you know, we had the Hispanic groups and communities come out. We had the Black communities come out. We had the undocumented youth come out. We had the Native and the Indigenous communities come out. We had the LGBTQI community come out. And we even had portions of the poor white communities beginning to join us, because what we realized is that we were all being oppressed and being failed by our government institutions in different ways, and that we were better off making allies than still having those internal struggles and fights. And that unity actually both created a safe space for many of us, but also empowered us to hold, you know, the oppressors, if you may, accountable. So I guess that would be my feedback on that.
Wow, incredible, Sarah. Would any Maquiba?
Absolutely. I do want to take a stab at that question. So how do we empower all communities to feel welcome, safe, and valued? I think the first thing is to acknowledge, going off of what Sarah said, is absolutely to acknowledge the history component of it, right? And so the historical content of who we are in America is built on white supremacy. And it was purposefully, intentionally put to not include a variety of individuals. So I think it is all about education, but it's also to acknowledge trauma. Trauma is translated throughout our body. It's called intergenerational trauma, right? And so Dr. Joy DeGruy, who coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, talks about how trauma is infused in the DNA from our ancestors. And so from that trauma, we always operate in fight or flight. So it's going to be really important for us to navigate and address trauma and how trauma is still being very much prevalent today, right? So as we saw individuals like George Floyd being publicly lynched, that arose different types of trauma for individuals. Maybe they thought of Emmett Till, maybe they thought of Sandra Bland. So a lot of different things purposefully come up. And so we have to acknowledge what took place in the past and why am I feeling like I have to defend or survive, kind of like what Sarah said earlier. Why do I feel like I have to survive the day versus thriving the day? So we have to acknowledge trauma as well. And then the last thing that I would recommend to address this is to talk to white people. White people have to understand that it's not just on the marginalized communities to fix anything, honestly. It's truly on white communities to hold themselves accountable, because we always focus on those that are oppressed versus focusing on the oppressor.
I would offer a practical application to speak to the oppression, to speak to the education. And that is, and it showed up for us here when the Black Lives Movement became very prevalent and people were having this debate about what is it and why isn't it all lives and all of that, is that people tend to talk and associate with like people. So, you know, you can have the best heart, Bill, you can have the best heart, but if all the people you socialize with are white men, then you'll never get my opinion on something. And you may never learn why Black Lives Matter. So we created conversation opportunities, dialogue time. And we tend to do it around Martin Luther King Day as part of our city celebration. And we actually break people off into different themes and something you could do for the community or something for yourself kinds of things, where we allow people to have safe space conversations. You might say something, we have ground rules, talking about race is hard. So you may say something that's not received well, but your commitment in this space is to work through it. And that's just a very elementary starting point that we've done with unity in the community.
Yeah, if I could add just a footnote, I mean, I agree with everything that I've heard. I think that leadership matters. And so as I speak to, you know, I'm a member of a profession that is not very diverse as a lawyer. And I've been a bar association leader. And so I speak about diversity and inclusion all the time to my white colleagues because this profession needs to change. Leadership matters. And in that respect, we know where the power is in government, in our communities, in our corporations, and most of it is not in people of color. So if there's going to be systemic change in the future, and we saw, you know, we saw people find their voices last summer. We saw, you know, multi-generational, multiracial protests that were very different than what we had seen before. If that is to be sustained, and that's really going to result in systemic change that provides equity, leadership has to step up. And that means, as I speak to my colleagues in the profession, if your role is not to be a mediator, your role can be to be an ally. You can lead by speaking to your colleagues wherever you are about these issues. Seek to learn more about them, think about them, and then use the power that you've got, the influence that you have if you're over 30, not to be ageist, but if you're over 30, you've probably got influence and access and privilege. If you're under 30, you probably have association, and that gives you power as well. But then use it to drive equity.
Great, thank you, Carl, so much. So I've got one final question for everybody, and I'm just looking for a quick response. So for communities that are looking to start initiatives like GCCT or PACT or Unity in the Community, who do you recommend starts the initiative? And then a quick follow-up to that, is there space in these initiatives for public officials, public or elected officials, and how could they participate in a productive manner?
Yeah, yes, if I have the question in mind. You know, my answer to the question, where do you start, is start where you are and make a difference there. So if there isn't some process like this, start one and then go from there. There is a role to play. I understand that these disputes will come before judges, and so some judges won't want to play. But there are judges, there are retired judges, there are lots of people who are willing to engage in the hard work that is necessary to build trust relationships within communities to help those communities through difficult times and through divisions within the community.
I'll take a stab at this. You want to go?
I was just gonna say, there was a second part to your question and I couldn't remember what it was.
Oh, no, you're fine. It's just whether there's space for public officials or publicly elected officials
Okay.
in these groups.
Thank you.
You want me to go? But honestly, I think that this, I'm in a space of trying to wrap my head around this myself. Again, with my system lens, I think of, there has to be a moment where power lays down their power and they decide to give a little bit of that power away. So I know that can be really hard because we elect officials to represent us. But if in your community, like for example, in Bloomington, if there are individuals in our community that have built coalitions, I think that it's important for elected officials to go to those coalition meetings versus speaking on their behalf. and then getting the permission to speak on their behalf in a public setting. But I do think that we have, I think earlier in our conversation, we talked a lot about dynamic. And I think that power has to shift, and shifting the power will allow, one, I do believe that it allows the trust to be built. And then I also believe that it gives the opportunity for individuals to speak. And so I don't want to speak in theory, but in practice, that's what I've done. So I work intentionally with students and advocate for them on their behalf. And I've literally infused myself in their space, like, hey, I'm here just to be here to support you. And they welcome that because I'm not the one in the center. It's them that's at the center. And I do my best as an administrator to support their needs, even beyond the IU community. And so I think that is going to be really important for us to know when to give power away and to be okay with that. And so I think that some public officials should not be in certain spaces or speaking on behalf, but I think that they should go to those spaces without knowing that, without them feeling like they have to be in charge.
And so I want to respond using my public official hat. I was on the San Leandro City Council for 10 years. I was the first person of color of any ethnic underrepresented group to be elected in this town in its first 125 years. So that carried a lot of burden. So I'm going to say, yes, public officials should be in these spaces, but there's the but. So we have some, what the but is hangs on what's the end game. What is it that you want to walk away with? For instance, we have a big movement right now led by young people for reimagining police, for doing something different with the police structure in our town. That's fine. They're doing a great job going around educating people, so forth and so on. But that's not going to happen. What they want is not going to happen without some education and involvement of political people. But right now, teach the world, teach me, I'm learning, do that. Same time, unity in the community, you drop in as your interest allows you and your time allows you. There's a few council members that are always there. Other people in the room are saying, why are the council members there? Well, the council members need to hear. They need to hear, they need to learn too. And from a council member's perspective, if I was still in office, there are different kinds of leaders, and this is who people need to elect and appoint. There are those who serve with servant leadership. You can't be a leader unless you have someone to follow you. So leadership is really followship. I can only be a leader if the people allow me to be a leader. So I need people. I need to be in that room. I need to check with them. I need to be an effective leader. Now you have effective leaders who are full of ego and just get out there and do things. That's not who I'm talking about.
Wow. This is, I love listening to this dynamic conversation. And I know that I could talk to any one of you for a few more hours, let alone all 5 of you for, the rest of the night. But we only have an hour here today. So we're going to wrap things up. But before we do, I want to ask each of you, starting with Candace, then we're going to turn to Sarah, Carl, Maquiba, Sirlane. Can you give us 30 seconds of concrete advice for those mediators, dispute resolution practitioners, and attorneys who are watching this call thinking, what can I do in my community? Candace?
Sure, thanks, Bill. So hearing from everybody's experiences today, it sounds like when things have gone wrong in a city, the hindsight was 20/20 and the preparation wasn't there. So being proactive rather than reactive to these situations and divisions seems to be the best way to counteract the division and hope to build trust and resilience in the community.
Sarah?
Sorry, I just want to applaud and encourage everyone that works in conflict resolution to first and foremost be flexible in crisis and do not fear conflict. I know it looks really intense in moments and maybe it feels hopeless, but understand and recognize that oftentimes conflict is the first step to necessary changes that we have been unable to maybe get through those political procedures and processes. And so sometimes conflict and disruption and intervention is required. So I guess lean into it, and don't give up hope, because the mass majority of the issues we are dealing with are man-made problems, and there are resolutions and solutions to them. So continue pushing and communicate to as many stakeholders as you can, and be creative in your approaches of bending rules a little bit to get your end goal, as long as your means are ethical.
Carl.
Yeah, I guess as I talk to dispute resolution professionals, I think people I talk to think of themselves as mediating some community-wide dispute and bringing an end to all of the issues that challenge the community. I hope that happens for you and that you're successful. But for most of us, the opportunities are a little bit more limited, and that's okay. That's why I said a minute ago, start where you are and do your work there. There are so many places where your skills can be useful to your community to bring people together, to build trust and relationships, to resolve some of the things that cause them not to trust each other, and to give them the tools they need to be able to work on the bigger issues.
Akiba.
Yeah, I'm super excited to share these. I have 3 takeaways of practical things to do. 1, learn trauma-informed care. It's really important, it's really impactful, because then you can understand some trauma that individuals, the systems and things that individuals might go through. 2, education. Continue to educate yourself based off of the community's needs. If it is a marginalized community, be adamant about going to conferences, go to different spaces, so that you can learn about those specific marginalized groups that you're working with. 2, the third final thing is to be creative. It's no one way to do it. So operate in a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset to support those individuals that you are supporting with mediation.
And Sir Lane.
So I would say to facilitators, mediators, and the like, to be aware of implicit bias in your work. And we didn't even talk about that. But even with Unity in the Community, I've gotten everybody together and we come together every month. I had just recently a pastor speak to the generalization of Asian people. And I was like, did he just say that? He just said that. And it wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. It was a generalization. And I had to call him on it, and I had to fix it. So you have to be in tune to your own, what you carry and what you need to know, as well as what other people are carrying into the room, and speak to it. So I would say that, and I would say be intentional about inviting people to the tables that you're at who have historically been omitted, or if you are at that table, giving them voice. If people are often in situations that intimidate them or are foreign to them. So give them space, open up the voice. And again, I said this earlier, I believe, just treat people with respect, not with entitlement.
So you all have had such great ideas. You stole all of mine. We've got be proactive, lean in flexibly. Conflict is the first step. Start where you are to build trust. Trauma-informed care. Continue to educate yourself. Be creative. Be aware of your implicit biases. Be intentional about inviting those that are historically underprivileged. And I'm going to build on Sir Lane's last point for mine. Leverage your privilege to give voice to those who are disadvantaged in the community. I love talking to you all, and I just want to thank you for having this conversation and for giving us the opportunity to share it with our colleagues at the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. Hopefully everyone watching this will take 1 or 2 steps, write them down, just commit to them right now about how you're going to work in your community, whether that's having a conversation with someone, using your privilege in a certain way, or taking an implicit association test for the very first time. start. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in many communities. And we look forward to hearing about what's happening in your community at the next conference.